11 days. That's all it took for the United States to move from toppling a regime to selling another country's oil and holding the money itself. $500 million. Venezuelan oil. Proceeds parked not in Caracas, not fully in Washington, but in accounts controlled by the U.S. government with a key node in Qatar. This is not a routine energy deal. It is power exercised in its rawest form. For the first time in modern history, the United States is not just sanctioning, advising, or stabilizing a nation. It is running the core of its economy, deciding who touches the money, who doesn't, and when, while telling creditors to look away. Supporters call it pragmatic, critics call it dangerous, but everyone understands one thing. Once you control the oil, you control the future. Stay with me, because before we can judge whether this is rescue or overreach, we need to understand what problem this move is really trying to solve and why it was designed this way. And that takes us deeper. At the center of this story is a problem that Washington has faced for decades but never solved like this. Venezuela is rich in oil, yet buried under debt. Up to $170 billion owed to bondholders, oil companies, and foreign creditors. Any dollar that flows into the country risks being seized the moment it lands. That reality is why investors stayed away, why infrastructure collapsed, and why rebuilding always stalled before it began. So the Trump administration chose a radical workaround. Instead of letting Venezuela receive the money and lose it to courts, the United States would collect, hold, and release it. Treasury oversees the accounts, licenses flow through OFAC, courts are blocked, creditors are sidelined. In theory, this creates order where chaos once ruled. In practice, it concentrates extraordinary authority inside the executive branch. This is not just about oil revenues, it is about who decides what counts as legitimacy, protection, and consent in a post-regime landscape. And to understand why this approach even became possible, we have to step back into Venezuela's long collapse and America's evolving playbook. To see how we arrived here, you have to understand the cycle that broke Venezuela long before the tanks rolled in. Oil was never just an industry. It was the state itself. For years, oil revenues paid for everything. Subsidies, politics, loyalty. When prices were high, the system looked stable. When prices fell, the illusion cracked. Debt filled the gap. Corruption hardened into habit. And institutions weakened quietly year after year. As revenues collapsed, Venezuela borrowed more against future oil that no longer produced enough to pay the past. Creditors piled up, sanctions followed, infrastructure decayed, and eventually the country reached a point where even reform could not move fast enough to escape the trap. That is the mechanism at work here. Once a resource state loses credibility, money becomes untouchable. Any inflow attracts lawsuits, seizures, and paralysis. The U.S. didn't invent this problem, but by stepping in now, it chose to inherit it. And inheritance always comes with hidden costs, which surfaced almost immediately when the first oil sale finally went through. The first crack appeared, not with protests or lawsuits, but with a transaction. $500 million. That was the value of the first U.S. brokered sale of Venezuelan oil. A milestone, officials said, proof that the system could work. But look closer. The money didn't go to Venezuela. It didn't go to creditors. It went into accounts controlled by the U.S. government with a primary hub in Qatar. Suddenly, what was abstract became real. Who holds the money? Who decides when it moves? And under what authority? Supporters pointed to history, Iran, escrow accounts, sanctions-era workarounds. Critics saw something else entirely, an offshore structure, executive-controlled, vulnerable to politics and legal challenge. Even inside Washington, unease surfaced. Democrats warned this crossed a line. Lawyers flagged exposure. Banks quietly calculated the cost of scrutiny, subpoenas, and reputational risk. And yet the sale went through. Because once a system is built to bypass everyone, creditors, courts, even allies. Its success is measured only by one thing: control. If you're finding this analysis useful, stay with me, because the real story isn't the sale itself, it's the machinery behind it. And that machinery is far more consequential than it looks. What makes this machinery so powerful is not the oil, it's the architecture around it. At the center sits the US Treasury, not as a policymaker, but as a gatekeeper. Accounts are overseen, licenses issued, transactions filtered, money moves only with approval. On paper, this looks technical. In reality, it is structural dominance. Sanctions provide leverage, oil sales provide cash flow, and control over accounts provides discipline. Venezuela's interim leadership cooperates because it has little choice. Creditors are frozen out because they are legally blocked. Oil companies hesitate because reputational and legal risks hover over every deal. Even banks calculate whether proximity to power is worth the scrutiny. Qatar enters not as a beneficiary, but as a neutral valve, a place where money can sit, move, and remain shielded from seizure. It's not about geography, it's about insulation. This is the hidden mechanism, a system designed to function precisely because it bypasses trust and replaces it with control. But systems like this don't stay contained. They create pressure, and pressure always looks for a release point, which brings us to the next moment of stress, when politics, legality, and human reality begin to collide. Pressure rarely announces itself politely. It arrives when competing truths collide. On one side, the administration pushes forward, confident that deals will multiply. Chevron believes production can rise by 50%. Advisors see momentum. Control is working. On the other side, the legal and political fault lines widen. Treasury becomes the banker, but not the decider, at least on paper. Congress demands briefings. Senators question authority. Lawyers warn that once money touches U.S. soil, legal complexity explodes. Banks hesitate. This isn't just another account. It's a magnet for letters, subpoenas, and public scrutiny. Take it on, and you inherit the entire Venezuelan problem, past, present, and future. And then there's the moral hazard. Every transaction invites temptation. Wheat contracts, middlemen, quiet kickbacks. The very corruption this system claims to prevent lurks inside the process itself. This is the second crisis, quieter than the first but more dangerous, because it tests whether control can substitute for legitimacy. And when legitimacy frays, the impact doesn't stay in Washington or Doha. It moves outward toward the people who have already lost the most. And this is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Because while governments debate accounts and authority, you are the one living with the consequences. If you're Venezuelan, you've already paid the price. You left home. You crossed borders. You rebuilt your life from fragments while your country's wealth sat underground, unreachable. Now you're told the oil is finally moving again, the money exists, but it doesn't belong to you, not yet. It's held, filtered, delayed, decided by others who promise it will come back the right way, and maybe it will. But trust once broken does not return on schedule. For those still inside Venezuela, hope comes with conditions. Cooperation, compliance, patience. For those outside, questions linger. Who qualifies? Who decides? When does help become control? This isn't just an energy policy. It's a test of whether power can act on behalf of people without speaking for them. If this resonates with you, if you believe these decisions matter beyond headlines, stay with me, because what happens next doesn't stop at Venezuela's borders. What unfolds in Venezuela is already echoing far beyond its shores, because when a superpower directly controls another country's resources, the signal travels fast. Allies watch closely, rivals take notes. Financial centers quietly reassess risk. This isn't just about oil markets, it's about precedent. If the United States can seize, sell, and hold the proceeds of a nation's core asset, even temporarily, others will ask where the line is. Countries rich in resources but poor in institutions feel exposed. Creditors wonder whether contracts still mean what they once did. And states under sanctions see both a warning and a blueprint. Qatar's role sharpens the message. Neutral hubs become strategic nodes. Finance, diplomacy, and energy blur into a single system. What looks like a workaround today becomes a template tomorrow. And geopolitics is unforgiving with templates. Every major power studies systems like this, not for intent, but for replicability. What can be copied, what can be resisted, what must be preempted. That's how localized control turns into global tension. Quietly, gradually, inevitably. Which brings us to the hardest question of all, not what this system is, but where it leads. The future now hinges on three paths, each plausible, each unsettling in its own way. The first is the optimistic scenario. Control stabilizes the system. Oil flows increase. Revenues are disbursed carefully, transparently, and gradually rebuild Venezuela's basic capacity. Elections follow. Authority transfers. The U.S. steps back, claiming success. History records this as an uncomfortable but effective intervention. The second is the middle path, and often the most likely. Oil keeps moving, money keeps flowing, but oversight hardens into permanence. Temporary measures stretch on. Legal ambiguity becomes normalized. Venezuela functions, but never fully governs itself. Stability exists, but sovereignty remains conditional. Then there is the worst case. Legal challenges multiply, political backlash erupts, corruption seeps through the cracks, control without legitimacy breeds resentment. Inside Venezuela and abroad, what began as stewardship hardens into occupation by another name. These are not moral judgments, they are system outcomes. Because when power replaces trust, efficiency rises, but resilience falls. And systems built this way rarely end cleanly, which leaves one final question, not for Washington, but for all of us watching. What this moment forces us to confront is uncomfortable, but necessary. Power can fix things quickly, trust takes longer, and history rarely rewards those who confuse the two. The United States now holds Venezuelan oil revenues, not because it wants to, but because the system made every other option impossible. That may be true, but once you step into that role, you don't just manage money, you inherit responsibility, perception, and consequence. For Venezuela, the question is whether control becomes a bridge back to sovereignty or a ceiling above it. For the world, the question is simpler and more dangerous. Who decides when intervention ends? Because if this model works, it will be used again. And if it fails, the damage won't be contained. This isn't about Trump or Democrats or oil. It's about how power behaves when institutions collapse and what replaces them. If you want to understand where global politics is heading next, this is not a side story. It's a preview. Share this if you think these choices deserve scrutiny. And stay here, because the next chapter won't be quieter.